When Henry Wallace returned after a heart attack, he stood silently before the wooden house he once built with his own hands, only to find the lock had been changed. And people claimed he had died long ago. Can a person still exist when even their name has been erased from the memory of the community? Henry Wallace awoke to the sharp tang of disinfectant, a bitter scent that clung to his nostrils, mixed with the faint rubber smell of gloves and tubing. Above him, the fluorescent lights shone mercilessly, a cold whiteness that pressed into his eyes until they watered. Beside him, the monitor beat out its patient rhythm, steady, insistent, at once reassuring and accusing. It reminded him that his heart, once so reliable, had faltered, had betrayed him. He raised his hand with care, as if even the air had weight. A needle still pierced the back of his hand, taped securely. Beneath the parchment skin, blue veins stood out, trembling like cords stretched too thin. They quivered with the same fragility that Henry now felt in every movement. The door opened. A nurse entered quickly, carrying a plastic tray. She avoided his eyes, her steps brisk, her words efficient. "Mr. Wallace, you're being discharged today. These are your prescriptions, 2 tablets daily." She set down the bag of medicine, placed a sheaf of instructions beside it, and left almost in the same motion. Her shoes clicked down the hallway before Henry could form a single question. "No pause." No gentle word. Just another body processed and moved along. He looked at the room. No flowers by the window. No card on the table. No phone call waiting to be answered. It occurred to him that had he died here, they would simply have wheeled away the body, changed the sheets, scrubbed the floor, and made space for the next patient. His absence would not have disturbed the air for long. With effort, Henry swung his legs over the side of the bed. His chest felt hollow, as though something more than muscle had been taken from him. It was not only the heart that had grown weaker, but the sense of himself, of his place in the world. For weeks he had lain here, and not a single familiar voice had crossed the threshold. The only words spoken to him belonged to nurses on their rounds, reading from invisible scripts. He pulled on his old coat, its fabric faded, its shoulders worn to threads. Still, it carried a memory of warmth. He gathered the small bag of pills, lifted his battered suitcase, and stepped into the corridor. The wheels rasped and clattered across the linoleum, a lonely sound that echoed back at him like mockery. Outside, the sky sagged low and grey, heavy with early autumn. The wind cut across his face with a knife's edge, sharp and cool. He stood on the hospital steps, filling his lungs with air that seemed colder than memory, testing whether his heart was truly ready for the work of living again. Nobody stood waiting for him. Nobody called his name. He raised a hand for a taxi. The driver gave him a single glance in the rearview mirror and asked nothing. The car hummed forward, carrying him through miles of tired fields and broken fences, past warehouses slumping into weeds. Silence filled the cab, broken only by the muffled rhythm of tires against road. Henry stared out at the passing world, at houses with warm windows, and thought how each square of light belonged to someone else, not him. When the car stopped, he stepped out at the dirt road that wound into his old neighborhood. He paid, closed the door, and watched the taillights disappear. Then he was alone, an old man with a bag of pills and a suitcase that seemed heavier than ever. The street stretched before him, half remembered, half strange. Grass burst through the cracks at the edges. Shop signs peeled to grey shadows, shutters nailed tight against dust and time. Each step along the gravel made a small crunch, a faint declaration that he still lived, though nobody had come to notice. At last, he saw it. The house, the wooden walls, the slanted porch, the roof of tin that had once held strong against storms. Memory struck him of evenings spent beneath that roof with a mug of coffee, watching the sun spill across the fields. For a moment, warmth stirred in his chest, until his heart clenched, not from illness, but from shock. The lock was new, Bright steel glinted on the door where his old brass once sat. A notice was taped across the splintering wood. Property transferred. New owner. Doyle Real Estate. Henry reached out. His calloused fingers brushed the paper. Trembling. He knocked. Inside. Footsteps approached. The door opened to reveal a man of 40, his expression guarded, his eyes sweeping Henry from head to foot. "What do you want?" the man asked. Henry's mouth dreed. Words crowded his throat. "This is my house," but they refused to pass his lips. Everything contradicted him. The fresh lock, the official paper, the stranger's certainty. The man shut the door. The bolt slid into place with a sound both sharp and final. Henry stood with his palm still on the wood, as if trying to press through into another life. He felt like a ghost, haunting the threshold of the home that had once been his sanctuary. He stepped back slowly. The street was silent. No neighbor stirred. No curtain lifted. The world continued as if Henry Wallace had never returned, as if he had perhaps never lived at all. He dragged his suitcase to the steps of the porch and lowered himself. The wind carried the bitter scent of burning leaves from somewhere distant. He opened the pill bag, tipped one tablet into his palm, and swallowed it with water from a plastic bottle. The liquid chilled his throat. "I survived a heart attack," he thought, "but there is no place left that calls me back." The sun angled low, striking the wall of the house, illuminating every crack in the wood. He remembered his hands hammering those planks, lifting beams into place. Mark. Each nail had carried part of him. Now it was nothing more than history written on wood. A record nobody cared to read. He sat long after the sun vanished. Darkness rolled over the street, swallowing the houses one by one. No porch light flickered on to greet him. No familiar voice rose to ask where he had been. Cold seeped into his bones. At last he rose, grasped the handle of the suitcase, and began to walk. The path led toward the edge of the forest, dark and uncertain. Each step carried him farther from the life erased, deeper into a future with no shape. In his mind, a single thought circled without mercy, echoing like the beep of the hospital monitor. "No one noticed when I disappeared. Who will notice now that I have returned?" Henry Wallace drifted through the town like a ghost that everyone had once known but no longer recognized. His steps dragged along the cobblestones, each shuffle carrying the brittle sound of gravel grinding, as though the earth itself was shifting beneath him. The morning sun rolled down from the hills, scattering silver light across walls mottled with age. Yet inside his chest, the chill refused to melt. The bag of pills in his hand felt heavy, a reminder that his own heart had betrayed him, and now even his house had joined in the betrayal. He turned back toward the door. The notice taped across the wood trembled in the wind, producing a faint crackle like an old newspaper being crushed. Henry raised his hand and knocked again, softly this time, as though trying to reassure himself that he still existed. From within came the sound of slippers dragging, then the metallic turn of a key. The door creaked open. The man from the day before appeared again. Shirt wrinkled, coffee cup steaming in his hand. His brow furrowed as his eyes narrowed at Henry. "I told you already. What do you want here?" His voice carried irritation, the blunt tone of someone interrupted from routine. Henry inhaled. His words came haltingly, rough and wooden, as if dragged across splintered boards. "This is my house. That porch there, I built it with my own hands. I lived here 30 years. How? The man chuckled dryly, a sound with no warmth. "Not anymore. Papers are clear. You should find another place." "How?" Henry searched the man's eyes, hoping to glimpse pity, or even doubt. Instead, he saw only the impassive wall of a stranger's certainty. Then the door closed, more decisively than before. The lock turned. Metal clicked with the finality of a gavel, hammering down the last of Henry's hope. He stood in silence, pressing his palm against the cool new lock, tracing the grooves of its polished surface. There were no scratches, no familiar marks left by his hand. This lock bore no memory of him, It declared that Henry Wallace had never belonged here at all. A sparrow landed briefly on the fence, chirped once, and flew away. Henry's eyes followed it, and he felt as though the whole world were moving forward without him, swift and unbothered. He dragged his suitcase across the yard and turned to the neighbor's house. The green-painted door, once so familiar, was now firmly closed. He knocked. A middle-aged woman answered, peering at him as if he were a vagrant. Henry forced a smile, introduced himself. Her brows furrowed. She blinked, then shook her head slowly. I didn't think anyone lived there anymore. People said it was sold. And Henry tried to explain that he had been in the hospital, that the house was his, but her eyes retreated. Her voice softened into apology. If the deed has changed hands, perhaps you're mistaken. I'm sorry. You. The door closed gently but firmly. Henry remained staring at the green paint, remembering the afternoons he had once repaired that very hinge for her husband, remembering the voices of children calling him Uncle Henry across the fence. Now all of it had evaporated, leaving only his figure standing in thin air. He tried other doors along the street. The results were the same: suspicion in some eyes, avoidance in others, the occasional forced smile to mask discomfort. To them he seemed little more than a faded outline, a whisper of the past intruding on the present. Nobody was sure he was even real. By noon, weary and parched, Henry pulled his suitcase to the old general store. The glass door was clouded with dust, the wooden sign above it tilted at a tired angle. Yet from within drifted familiar scents: roasted coffee, peppermint candies, the memories of decades ago. Inside, the shopkeeper, hair silvered and tied neatly, looked up from her register. Her gaze caught Henry's, and for a moment recognition flickered. Then her eyes dropped, as though wary of acknowledging too much. "Mr. Wallace?" she said. Voice tentative. Henry nodded, waiting for warmth. Instead, she murmured, "It's been such a long time. I thought you'd gone somewhere far away." "One?" Henry's throat constricted. "I was in the hospital. My heart is not what it once was." "See." The shopkeeper lowered her gaze, fiddling with her stack of receipts. At last she whispered, "The house. I heard it was sold. Frank Doyle holds the deed now. They say it's all legal. I don't know more." "One?" Henry swallowed his reply, turned, and left. In his pocket the pill bottle rattled faintly, its sound like chains dragging across stone. He carried himself to the abandoned post office and lowered onto the cracked bench outside. The sun blazed overhead, igniting silver strands in his thinning hair. Henry opened his battered leather notebook, flipped to the first page, and with a trembling pencil wrote, "Day of return. No one knew I had vanished. Not even my house remembers me." He paused. Wind lifted the edge of the notebook, flipping a page on its own. Henry did not stop it. Blank paper spread out before him, silent and empty. As empty as the deed where his name no longer appeared. By evening, he wandered again to the house. From across the road he saw the porch that he had once nailed together now, dressed with a new hanging pot of flowers. Through the windows, a lamp glowed amber. Laughter spilled out. Life had moved in and rooted itself where his own life had been. He lingered in the shadows, chest aching with every breath. He could not look away. Behind the curtain, a figure appeared: Frank Doyle himself, holding a glass of beer. Standing in casual possession, his gaze drifted outward, caught Henry in the darkness. Doyle smirked, raised the glass in a mocking salute. A victor's gesture. Henry turned. The decision came hard and sharp. Tomorrow, he would go to the land records office. He would ask, argue, demand his name be restored. But tonight, his body carried no strength for battles. Tonight, he could only walk. He took the dirt path toward the forest. Leaves crunched underfoot, brittle and loud in the silence. The sound reminded him of nights long ago, marching with comrades through hostile terrain. Back then, shadows had been heavy but never lonely. because others had walked beside him. Now there was only his heartbeat, unsteady and uncertain, echoing his solitude. At last he lowered himself beside a tree, suitcase pressed into service as a pillow. Above him, the sky unrolled with stars, cold and indifferent. Henry whispered into the night, "I am still alive." But who will believe it? The wind moved through the branches without reply. Only the rustle of leaves answered, a fragile sound confirming what Henry already feared, that his presence was now as thin and fleeting as ash scattered across forgotten ground. Dawn spread across the town like a pale sheet being pulled over weary ground. Henry Wallace rose stiffly from beneath the tree where he had spent the night. His back ached as if each vertebra had been pressed by stone. His chest burned with small spasms that reminded him, mercilessly, of his frailty. The dew glittered on the grass in front of his old porch, each droplet bright as crystal, each one mocking him with its purity. Henry stood motionless for a long time, his hand resting on the handle of his suitcase, looking like a traveler pausing before an inn that no longer welcomed him. Then the door opened. From inside stepped a man with the polished assurance of someone used to claiming space. He wore a crisp white shirt tucked neatly into dark trousers, a tie knotted tight. His hair slicked back to a sheen. His shoes shone so brightly they caught the morning light, reflecting it like tiny mirrors. In his hand steamed a ceramic mug of coffee. He lifted his head, saw Henry, paused only a second, and then offered a smile, not of courtesy, not of surprise, but of someone who had anticipated this exact encounter. "Mr. Wallace, isn't it?" The man's voice was smooth. Too smooth. Needing no introduction. Henry frowned. He did not recognize him. Yet the man walked closer, extending his hand as if greeting an equal. "Frank Doyle? Real estate, here in the county. We've never met, but I know your name." "Oh." Henry's eyes lingered on the offered hand. He let it hang, unanswered, until Doyle withdrew it. Unfazed, the smile deepening. "I imagine you want to ask why the door has a new lock, and why the deed now carries my name." "How?" Henry gripped the suitcase handle tighter. The question Doyle posed aloud was the weight he had been carrying in silence since yesterday. "This is my home," Henry said at last. His voice was slow, rasping, dragged up from the bottom of his lungs. "That porch, I built it. Every post, every board." "And?" Doyle shrugged, sipping his coffee with a flourish that suggested leisure rather than confrontation. "But you don't live here now. Neighbors say you've been gone for months. In fact," he tilted his head, feigning sympathy, "some thought you had died." "And?" The word struck Henry harder than any bullet. His chest sized. He wanted to protest, to shout that he had been in a hospital bed, that his heart had waged its own war against him. But his mouth was dry, his throat choked. The word dead echoed within him not as speculation, but as a verdict, a silent death, unrecorded. Convenient for those who wanted him erased. Doyle's voice rolled on, steady as a legal recital. "By law, when an owner is absent for a prolonged period with no contact, property can be transferred if an agreement is secured. I purchased this house. Proper documents. You can confirm at the land office." Purchased." The word was spoken as if it referred to a chair, a tool, a discarded coat. But to Henry, this was the shelter he had raised after the war. The one place where his name had weight, where he had grieved his parents' passing and endured his wife's departure. It was the house that had testified to his survival. Henry took a step back, his hand pressing instinctively against his chest. Doyle noticed, and for an instant, a flicker of satisfaction gleamed in his eyes, as though he had struck not merely a legal victory, but a physical wound. "You don't look well," Doyle remarked lightly. "Think of this as an opportunity. Sell the memory. Take the cash. Find rest. You were a soldier, I respect that. But times change." "Ope." Henry drew breath slowly, struggling to steady the rhythm of his heart. "I did not sell," he said, low but firm. "I never sold." "Oh," Doyle laughed once, sharp and hollow. "You may not have sold, but the papers say otherwise. And in this world, Mr. Wallace, paper outweighs memory. Contracts matter. Nostalgia does not. Oh, the words scalded Henry more deeply than the autumn air. He turned, descended the steps, then paused, his eyes fixed on the porch column where long ago he had carved H.W. with his army knife. The letters were faint now, softened by years, but they remained etched into the grain. Henry pointed to it. That you cannot buy. Hisses. Doyle followed his gaze, gave a dismissive shrug, and retreated inside. The door slammed. Henry remained on the path, a solitary figure staring at wood and memory. He walked slowly down the street, each house watching him in silence. In his ears, Doyle's sentence repeated, "They thought you were dead." A single line, yet it dissolved every claim of his existence. At the end of town stood the land records office, a squat brick building with dusty glass doors. Inside, a ceiling fan turned sluggishly. Paper piles leaned like towers about to topple. A young clerk glanced up, eyebrows raised at the sight of the old man. Henry laid down his weathered documents, an old deed, his veteran's ID, the remnants of proof. The clerk leafed through, then shook his head. Current record lists Frank Doyle as owner. Transfer was legal. Notarized. In quote. But I never signed, Henry said, his voice quivering. The clerk sighed. Already bored. Then you'll need a lawyer to contest. But here, everything's valid. End 2. Henry stepped back into the heat. Sun bore down mercilessly. On the courthouse steps he stood, listening to the hollow rattle of pills in his pocket, sounding like bones. By late afternoon he returned once more to his house. Through the window glow, he saw Doyle's silhouette stretched across an armchair, legs crossed, body reclined in possession. Henry's throat tightened. He longed to knock, to demand entry, to reclaim. But his legs rooted to the pavement. Instead, he slid down against a utility pole. Crickets sang from the grass. Relentless, Henry reached into his coat and drew out a tarnished badge. Once bright silver, he clasped it tightly, remembering the days when his name carried honor, when comrades had trusted his steady hands. Now it was only cold metal against weaker flesh. Night deepened. The door opened again. Doyle stepped onto the porch with a cigarette. Smoke curled in the lamplight. His eyes swept the street, found Henry slumped there. Doyle's lips curved in a faint, victorious smirk. He exhaled, smoked deliberately, then turned back inside, leaving the door to close behind him with casual authority. The house glowed warmer, brighter, as if mocking Henry with its comfort. Henry sat until the horizon paled. The chill settled into his bones, and each heartbeat pricked sharper. Finally, he rose, dragging the suitcase once more. Across the damp grass, his shoes left faint trails in the dew. Doyle's words followed him like chains. In this life, only paper holds value. Memory holds none. Henry knew then that his battle had shifted. No longer was his enemy a distant war in some foreign land. His enemy had a name, a face, and a deed of paper. Frank Doyle, the man who had turned him into a ghost upon the very soil he had built with his own hands. Henry Wallace shuffled down the old street, the suitcase behind him dragging with a stubborn squeak. Each rotation of the wheels left shallow grooves in the uneven road, as if his presence could only be carved in fleeting scratches, soon to be filled by dust. Autumn wind swept the rows of sycamores, and dry leaves spun like coins tossed by invisible hands. They fluttered down onto porches of houses he once knew. Familiar shapes remained the fences, the brick walls, the stoops, but every corner carried a thin film of strangeness, as though someone had taken a cloth and wiped away his part in the picture. He no longer strode directly to doors. Instead, he lingered at the edge of each walkway, catching his breath, listening to the beat of his heart. Only after a pause would he knock. The sound was soft, tentative, so light it hardly disturbed the silence. Yet inside Henry the thump echoed fiercely. At the first house, an old man appeared, hair like fine white ash, shoulders bent, sweater sagging at the sleeves. Henry remembered crouching under this man's sink years ago, wrench in hand, patching a leaking pipe while they joked about the town's baseball team. Now recognition flickered faintly in the man's eyes. He squinted, as if staring through fog. "You, Henry. Is it? I heard you had moved away." "I see, yeah." Henry pressed his teeth together. swallowing down a tide of anger. He answered slowly, deliberately, each word chosen like a stone pulled from deep water. I never moved. I was in the hospital. That house over there, my house, still belongs to me. And, the neighbor shook his head, already retreating. I can't say. Only know, a new family came. And they claim the papers are proper. Maybe you should ask the land office. And, the door closed with tired finality. Henry stood staring at the green paint. His own shadow stretched long across the bricks, until at last he turned away. The pattern repeated, house after house. Some neighbors recognized his face. Some only tilted their heads, uncertain. But all answers carried the same refrain. The documents disagree. It was as if the town itself had been instructed to obey the ink on official pages, rather than the flesh and blood man standing before them. Henry began to understand that he was not simply homeless. He had been erased. He entered the corner store where the scent of roasted coffee and peppermint clung to the air like an old hymn. The bell above the door jingled, a cheerful sound mocking his heaviness. Behind the counter sat the shopkeeper, hair pulled back in a silver bun. She looked up and startled, then offered a cautious smile. Mr. Wallace, I thought you'd gone. Someone even said you'd passed away. Wed, Henry forced a smile of his own, more bitter than kind. I am alive. But my house, they tell me it was sold. Wed, the shopkeeper pressed her lips, fiddled with her ledger, eyes sliding away. I heard Frank Doyle bought it. All notarized. Perfectly legal. Perhaps speak with a lawyer. Wed, Henry nodded once, then left. Outside, the sun bore down, cutting his shadow short, mixing it with the weeds that grew through the broken sidewalk. He felt himself like those weeds, alive. Yes, but unwanted, sprouting where no one welcomed him. At last he reached the land office, a squat building of yellow brick with a peeling white sign. Inside, the air carried the thick smell of ink and dust. Ceiling fans turned lazily, blades stirring heat rather than easing it. Henry lowered his suitcase, set his bundle of papers on the counter. Old deed, tax receipts, the brittle slips he had guarded like treasure. The young clerk glanced at them, tapped keys on a computer, then shook his head without ceremony. According to our system, the property belongs to Frank Doyle. The deed of transfer is filed, signed, notarized. Henry blinked hard. Signed? I never signed anything. I was lying in a hospital bed. The clerk looked up, awkward, but unmoved. I cannot confirm that, but the document bears your name. Henry felt heat rising in his face. His hand smacked the counter before he caught himself his chest, warning him not to invite another betrayal. He steadied his breath. I am Henry Wallace. Standing here. That signature is not mine. Lesh. The clerk pressed his lips together, gave him the look one reserves for the stubborn elderly. If you believe it's false, you must hire counsel and bring a claim. Until then, the system recognizes only the file deed. That. Henry stepped outside. The glass door shut behind him with a hollow clap. His reflection warped on its surface, bent and indistinct, as if even the mirror could not recall his features. On the courthouse steps he paused, staring at the street. The thought slid coldly into his mind. Perhaps Frank was right. Perhaps in the eyes of the world, he was already dead. He walked again, aimless, until the shouts of children reached him. He found himself by the old elementary school. On the playground, children kicked a ball, their laughter ringing bright. Years ago he had stood at this same fence, watching, remembering his own childhood. Now he was only a passerby, invisible to their joy. He sank onto a stone bench, drew his leather notebook from his coat. On a fresh page he wrote with shaking hand, "My name has vanished from the records, but I am still breathing. Is anyone listening?" The letters sprawled uneven, shaky lines like branches bent by wind. He stared at them as if they might prove his existence, even if only here in pencil. Evening fell. Henry wandered once more toward his house. Through the curtains glowed light warm, golden, occupied. Doyle sat visible in silhouette, lounging with a glass in hand. Henry stood across the street. Chest tight, pulse skipping. If he collapsed here, he thought, Doyle might call an ambulance, but only for a stranger. A gust swept past, sending a brittle leaf to his shoe. Henry bent, picked it up, and held it as though it were evidence, delicate, temporary, but real proof that he still stood here. That night he sought shelter under the roof of an abandoned shed. Rats hvittered. Dust stung his throat. He curled around his suitcase, the hard metal latch pressing into his ribs. Sleep came jagged. In dream, he stood in a courtroom. "I am Henry Wallace," he declared. His voice thundered in the dream, yet no one reacted. The judge's gavel fell. On the paper the clerk wrote, "Absent." Dawn found him at the old church. The wooden door bore carvings of volunteers from years past, including faint letters he had once etched himself. He placed his palm over them. The wood was cold, indifferent. The priest, aged and stooped, came down the aisle. Surprise flickered across his face, then softened. "Mr. Wallace, I thought you'd gone. They told me your house had already changed hands." Henry nodded without words. Explanation had become exhausting. A wound reopened with each telling. He stepped back outside. The bell tower tolled, iron notes rolling through the sky. To Henry it sounded like confirmation. A public announcement that his name existed nowhere but in fading memories. He walked again, through streets where faces turned away. He realized it was not just the house he had lost his position in memory itself. He was a man without a place in record, without a place in recollection. By late afternoon he sat on the edge of the woods, suitcase beside him. From it he drew old photographs. One showed him years younger, standing proud before the house. Hands still firm, shoulders squared. He set the photo beside his bottle of pills, gazed long. Then, softly, as though speaking to no one but the wind, he whispered, "I am still here, even if the papers deny it." End quote. The wind whistled through branches, carrying no answer. Yet the photo remained, proof that once, undeniably, Henry Wallace had belonged. The afternoon light faded slowly behind the rows of red brick buildings. Henry Wallace paused at the corner of the street. One hand braced against the handle of his battered suitcase. His breath came heavy, not from the short walk, but from the pressure in his chest, a reminder that the muscle inside him was no longer reliable. He stood still, letting his eyes trace the line of the street that once had been the map of his daily life. The tailor's shop where he had once fitted a suit for his brother was now a repair garage, its windows streaked with oil. The barber shop, where he had spent hours exchanging stories, listening to the snip of scissors and the hum of the clippers, now bore a faded "for rent" sign. Everything seemed altered, turned over, replaced. And yet at the far corner one thing remained. The old bar. Its wooden sign was scratched and scarred, the painted letters bleached almost to invisibility. Above it, a neon light flickered in irregular bursts, buzzing faintly, as if unsure it still had the right to glow. Something in Henry's chest clenched, but not entirely from pain. At least this place remained. A fragment of the past still clung here, stubbornly, like ivy to stone. He crossed the street slowly, his steps dragging, until he stood before the door. For a long moment he simply stared, gathering the courage that should not have been required for a place once so familiar. At last he pushed. The hinges creaked with a soft complaint. The smell struck him first. Stale alcohol steeped into wood, smoke layered into curtains, the musk of decades never fully scrubbed away. It was the scent of memory. Inside, little had changed. The long wooden bar still stretched across the left wall, polished only by years of elbows. The round tables bore scars of countless drinks, etched initials, burns from forgotten cigarettes. On the far wall hung photographs of soldiers, young faces in uniform, some smiling with bravado, others solemn with the knowledge of what awaited them. Henry's gaze moved across them until it froze. There, amid the collage, his own younger face stared back, clean-shaven, uniform pressed sharp, eyes alight with the impossible confidence of youth. For a moment he held his breath, as if to confirm he was not imagining it. At least here, his image had not been erased. A few heads turned as he entered. Some narrowed their eyes, squinting as if trying to place him. Others gave indifferent nods before returning to their conversations. Henry walked to the bar, placed himself on a stool whose wood was worn smooth by decades. The bartender looked up, A heavy man with a stomach pressing against his apron. Hair salt and pepper. Eyes dulled by routine. For a second, surprise crossed his face. Recognition. Perhaps. But it disappeared quickly into neutrality. "What'll it be?" he asked. Henry's voice rasped. "Water." He knew his heart could not bear whiskey anymore, no matter how much his soul longed for the burn. The bartender nodded without comment, poured a glass from the tap, set it down, then turned away to polish another. Henry let his eyes travel the room. In the corner, he saw men who had once been comrades, voices he had shouted alongside, shoulders he had leaned on in muddy trenches. Now their hair was grey, their bellies heavier, but they laughed easily, telling stories to one another. None beckoned him to join. He sipped water, the cold sliding down his throat. After a long pause, he spoke, his voice pitched to reach them. "I was at the military hospital. Heart attack. Nearly didn't make it." "En?" Expected silence. A moment of respect. At least a nod of recognition. Instead, the room merely paused for a heartbeat. Then conversations resumed. Chairs scraped. Laughter returned. One man near the door gave a short laugh, sharp enough to cut. "I thought you'd been gone for years," he said loudly enough for all to hear. A ripple of laughter followed. Not friendly laughter. Not the shared chuckle of comrades. But the thin, cruel sound of men amused at the expense of one who no longer belonged. Heat rose in Henry's face. His hand slammed the bar, palm flat. Glasses rattled. A few drops of liquor sloshed onto wood. "I'm still here," he growled. Each word landed heavy, like nails hammered into timber. The bartender continued polishing glasses. The jukebox in the corner played an old tune through crackling speakers. A few eyes turned toward him briefly, then away again. He was not seen as a comrade, not as a survivor, but as a disturbance. Pain shot through his chest, sudden and sharp. He bent forward, clutching his shirt front. Breath came shallow. The glass of water trembled, a thin spill running across the counter. No one moved. From a table came whispers. "He's old." "Ulf. Nothing left for ghosts like that." "Ulf." Henry forced himself upright, inhaling with deliberate steadiness. He would not collapse here. Not before them. He grasped the suitcase handle like an anchor, slid from the stool, and walked toward the door. Behind him, laughter continued, mingling with the tired song. It followed him out, chasing him onto the street. Outside, evening air cooled his skin. He leaned against the brick wall, closing his eyes. His heart still pounded, ragged and uneven. He reached into his pocket, found the pill bottle, shook one into his palm, swallowed it with the last swallow of water. Gradually the rhythm eased, though the ache of humiliation remained. He opened his eyes. Above him, the neon sign flickered again, buzzing faintly. Its glow spilled across the sidewalk in irregular flashes. Inside, life carried on without him. His photograph still hung on the wall. A younger Henry, immortalized. Yet the living Henry, older, frailer, had just been escorted out by indifference. He remained there a long time, watching the door, listening to muffled voices that no longer included him. Then, with effort, he turned and began to walk. The suitcase wheels clattered, marking each step. His shadow stretched long on the pavement beneath the lamplight, shivering with each flicker of the bulb. As he moved toward the edge of town, sounds of the evening drifted to him, the chirping of crickets, the bark of a dog, the hum of cars. The town lived on, vibrant, breathing, but none of its rhythm carried his name anymore. With each step, he whispered to himself, quiet but steady, like reciting a prayer, "I am still alive. I am still here." Oh, the words echoed only in his own head. No answer came. No ear received them. Yet he repeated them, as though the act itself might tether him against the tide of forgetting. Henry Wallace stepped out of the bar, just as the street lamps flickered on. The air outside was cooler than he expected, tinged with the faint metallic smell that always came before rain. He paused under the weak circle of light, letting his eyes adjust. Behind him, laughter still spilled from the bar, muffled through the wooden walls. Inside, his photograph still hung among the soldiers, smiling in uniform, forever young. But the man who had carried that uniform, who had given the best of his years to country and to this town, had just been pushed out like an unwelcome guest. He pulled his suitcase closer and began walking. The wheels rattled across the cobblestones as he moved through streets that had once belonged to him. Window after window glowed with yellow light. Shadows of families moved across curtains, children reaching for dinner plates, couples leaning close over the table, televisions humming their nightly news. It was a world he recognized, yet no longer inhabited. Nobody opened a door to say, "Henry, you're back." Nobody called his name from the warmth inside. At the edge of town, the asphalt gave way to dirt. The houses thinned. Ahead, a narrow river shimmered beneath the young moon. The water caught the light and threw it back in fragments, as though 1,000 tiny mirrors floated downstream. Henry stopped. This river had been his refuge once, years ago. After the war, he had come here to sit by the bank, to let the sound of water erase the echo of gunfire that lingered in his ears. The river had been a companion then, a place of rest. Now, it waited for him again, not as comfort but as shelter. He dragged the suitcase down to the bank, unlatched it, and surveyed its contents. A few worn shirts, 2 pairs of trousers, a small bottle of heart medication, his leather notebook, and a faded photograph. Beneath them lay an old green tarpaulin, wrinkled from years of disuse. Once carried on a hunting trip, he pulled it free. With slow, deliberate movements, he searched for branches, drove them into the earth, stretched the tarp over their angles. The wind caught the edge and snapped it like a flag. He anchored it with stones, weighing each corner until the flimsy roof sagged into place. At last he crouched beneath, lowered himself onto the ground, and exhaled. It was hardly shelter, a slant of canvas, trembling in the breeze, offering little protection from rain or cold, yet it gave him a boundary, however thin, between himself and the world that had expelled him. Within those walls of fabric, Henry was not entirely exposed. He could pretend, for a few hours, that he still possessed a corner to claim as his own. That first night, he lay flat on the hard earth, his head resting against the suitcase. Above him the stars scattered across the sky, faint pinpricks through the leaves. The chirring of crickets filled the silence, steady as a metronome. In his hand, he turned over the tarnished badge he had carried since the war, rubbing its edges with his thumb. The metal was cool, impersonal, yet it anchored him. "I am still here," he whispered. No reply came, save the murmur of the river, water against stone. At dawn, sunlight pierced the gap in the tarp, stabbing his eyes. Henry groaned and pushed himself upright, his back stiff, joints aching. The ground had not forgiven him his age. His shirt clung with dampness from morning dew. He rose slowly, stretched, rotating shoulders, bending forward. Old military habits surfaced, exercises performed not for strength now but for survival, a discipline to keep despair at bay. Afterward, he sat at the tent's mouth with his notebook. The pencil was stubby, the graphite faint. His hand shook, the letters crooked. Day 1 by the river. He still breathed. Still take my pills. No one knows, but I know. He closed the book and set it beside him. Across the water, a kingfisher darted from a branch, sliced into the river, emerged with a silver fish in its beak. Henry watched it lift into the sky. A flash of color against the pale morning. For a moment, warmth spread in his chest. Life carried on. Heedless of him, the bird needed no deed. No signature. Its existence was proof enough. The days that followed slipped into rhythm. Mornings began with stretches, the ritual of a soldier keeping order against chaos. At noon, he walked into town, purchased bread or a tin of beans from the store with the little pension he still received, then returned to eat alone on the bank. Evenings he wrote in the notebook, notes about each pill swallowed, fragments of dreams, observations about the river's current or the shape of the clouds. His handwriting faltered more each day, curling unevenly like the erratic beat of his heart. Children sometimes wandered near the forest edge. They spotted the tarp, pointed, laughed. Old man drifter, they called him. Henry did not scold them. He did not wave. He simply remained seated, still as driftwood, letting the tide of their laughter wash past. One afternoon the sky darkened. The wind rose. Tossing branches, Henry hurried, driving stakes deeper, tightening knots, weighing corners with heavier stones. The river foamed, stirred by gusts. Then the rain fell first in spatters, then in torrents. The tarp shuddered, water streaming down its slope. Henry crouched beneath, knees to chest. Suitcase braced against him. The storm howled. Branches cracked. The river roared. He closed his eyes. Memory blurred. Sandstorms in deserts. Barrages of artillery pounding trenches. He had survived those. He whispered to himself, voice trembling. I've lived through worse. This is only wind. But inside, a fiercer storm raged. Not weather, but the humiliation of having no roof, but a tattered tarp. No title, but forgotten. The thought pressed against his ribs that one morning they might find him here, lifeless, unnamed. Another body to be carried away without record. When the storm finally passed, he stumbled out. The river was swollen, muddy, littered with debris. Henry sat on a stone, picked up a pebble, flung it into the current. It struck with a hollow plunk, vanished beneath. The ripples spread, then dissolved. He watched until the surface smoothed again. That is me, he thought. A brief mark, gone in seconds. The next day brought an encounter. The old neighbor, the same who had shut the door days earlier, walked along the bank, fishing pole in hand. He halted when he saw Henry seated by the tent. Guilt flashed across his features. You're really staying here? The man asked. Henry nodded. No accusation. No glare. Just acknowledgement. The neighbor cleared his throat, cast his line into the water. For a while they sat in silence, the bobber swaying on the current. At last the man spoke without looking up. Frank Doyle told us you weren't coming back. Said you'd sold the house. I didn't know what to believe. Henry did not answer. Words seemed useless. He watched the line tremble in the water. Truth lived not in contracts, but in this moment, in the ache of his back, the dirt on his palms, the cold breath of the river. The neighbor reeled in a small fish, pocketed it, and left without farewell. Henry remained seated, hands shaking in his lap. It felt as though another piece of him had been cut away. That night his notebook received another entry. Day 10 by the river. They do not believe. Papers are stronger than memory. But I remain. A drop of rain from the previous storm had blurred the page, smudging his letters into grey. He stared at it and gave a hollow laugh. Even paper could not hold shape. A week slipped by. The tent became his house. The earth, his bed. The river, his companion. He grew accustomed to the smell of damp cloth, the chorus of insects, the sharp bite of night air. Each morning he crouched at the bank to splash water on his face, staring at his reflection. The man who looked back was gaunt, hollow-eyed. Sometimes Henry studied him so long he doubted whether it was himself or another shadow. And still he remembered the house, the porch beam carved with H.W. The kitchen filled with smoke from morning coffee. Memory was harder to extinguish than flame, though it burned him from the inside. One night, when the moon was thin, headlights swept the riverbank. A truck rumbled down the dirt road, its beams cutting across the tarp. Henry froze, gripping the suitcase instinctively. The lights lingered, then passed, dust rising in their wake. He sat unmoving long after, heart hammering. In that moment he understood his position more sharply than ever. He was a man outside the map. No address, no record, no line in the ledger. If death found him here, who would write his name? He opened the notebook, hands trembling. Day 17 by the river. I have become one, at the margins. But I will keep writing until the last line falls from my hand. He set the pencil down, listening to the river's murmur. In that sound, he fancied he heard his own voice faint, nearly drowned, but still there. The news did not reach Henry Wallace through any official paper, not through a letter stamped or a knock on his tent. It came by accident, overheard in the corner of the grocery store. He stood there holding a cheap loaf of bread, when two men near the counter spoke. Has Doyle sold the house at the bottom of the hill yet? One asked. Someone from the city came to look. The other replied. Contract should be signed soon. One. Henry tightened his grip until the paper wrapper crumpled. In his head rose a dull roar. not unlike helicopter blades from long ago. But this was no battlefield. It was only his home, passed around like a pawn in a game he was no longer invited to play. He stepped outside. Noon sunlight burned his eyes. The street lay silent, except for the whistle of wind through the power lines. Henry lowered himself onto the bench outside, breathing heavily. How much strength remained in him to fight for something that had once been unquestioned, his right to exist where he had built? That evening he entered a small law office. The glass door was cloudy. Inside sat a middle-aged man with black-rimmed glasses. Henry placed his yellowed papers on the desk. Tax receipts. The old deeds signed decades earlier. The lawyer scanned them, frowned, shook his head. On record. Everything is legal. Doyle has a contract bearing the name Henry Wallace. Notarized. Henry's voice rasped. That signature is not mine. I was in the hospital. The lawyer sighed. I believe you. But proving forgery requires experts. Witnesses. It would cost dearly. With your health, I fear you cannot endure a long case. Henry stared at the polished nameplate. Robert King, attorney at law. The word law shone. But to Henry, it was only another wall. He gathered the papers, his throat tight. So I have no name. No. Home. Is he cold? The lawyer offered no reply. Henry pulled his suitcase across the floor. The wheels groaned like bones. Back at the river he wrote in his notebook. Day 20. Doyle prepares to sell. The law gives me no place. My name survives only here. If I stop writing, I disappear. The next morning, he returned to the land office. He needed to see it himself. The clerk typed, then lifted his eyes. No. Your name is not in the system. Owner, Frank Doyle. Pending transfer to new buyer. And? Henry swallowed hard. And Henry Wallace? The clerk frowned. No such name recorded. And? It was like being cut from the map. He walked out wordless. Clouds gathered above. In the park, children played, while Henry sat frozen on the bench. A statue no one noticed. He remembered returning from war to banners and music. His name spoken aloud in celebration. Now, after one heart attack and some months of absence, that name was erased. That night by the river he whispered to the badge in his palm, I once had a name. Henry Wallace. I once had a house. The water lapped at the stones. Weak. Distant. A few days later, gossip spread fast. Doyle was signing with a buyer from the city. For the townspeople it was only business. For Henry it was the final cut. He tried one last office, the Veterans Hall. The young woman smiled politely. Explained. We keep service records. Not property. You are still listed as a soldier. But your house, beyond our reach. Hence, Henry asked. Voice breaking. So I exist as a soldier, but not as a man. She hesitated. Then nodded. He walked out. The flag above flapped in the wind. His edge frayed. He remembered, marching beneath it. His name engraved on dog tags. Now that name was crossed out in civil ledgers. That evening he wrote, Day 28. My name survives only in uniform. In life. They say, I do not exist. I write to resist. If this book is lost, so am I. He closed the notebook. Wind rattled the tarp. Beyond the river, lights of town glimmered. Somewhere Doyle was signing papers. Each beat of Henry's failing heart seemed to echo the stroke of that forged pen. And he wondered, if tomorrow he collapsed by this river, who would write his name one final time? Rain began in the evening. Just as Henry Wallace sat before his tent by the river, watching his own shadow blur across the dark water, the first drops tapped lightly on the thin tarp, then gathered into a wall of water, hammering down in waves. Wind swept across from the opposite bank, slicing cold against his skin. Henry pulled the edge of the tarp lower, trying to block the gusts. But the rain still forced its way inside. He clutched the suitcase to his chest, curling around it. His heart beat faster than it should. Each breath felt heavy, as if a stone had been placed upon him. He told himself it was only the chill, only the storm. But then a sudden stab of pain tore down his left side, sharp enough to wrench a cough from his throat. His breath caught, ragged, uneven. He staggered upright, hand pressed against the ground for balance, back striking the flap of the tent. Rainwater streamed down his neck. He fumbled through the suitcase. At the bottom lay his old cell phone, lifeless. The battery drained days ago. Memory flashed. A telephone inside the abandoned shed, not far away. Holding to that thought, he forced his body forward. Darkness wrapped him. Each step felt like dragging the river behind him. He leaned on trees, rocks, slipping in the mud, chest screaming with every movement. "Henry, keep moving," he whispered to himself, as if his voice alone could drag him forward. At last he reached the shed. The wooden door shrieked as he pushed it open. Inside was darkness and mildew. He stumbled to the corner, found the old landline, its body layered in dust. He lifted the receiver. Silence. He pressed buttons, only hollow clicks. The wire had been cut years ago. Henry lowered himself onto the cold floor. Pain throbbed. Sweat and rain streaking down his face. A single thought seared through him. If I fall here, no one will know. I will vanish in silence. The room was bare, walls stained with moss, broken windows letting in the storm. No trace of those who had ever lived. He realized he too had become like these walls, eroded, unnamed, forgotten. He dragged himself to the doorway, collapsed on the step. Rain struck his face, numbing it. He pressed a hand to his chest, gasping. In his mind rose the image of his wooden house, warm lights glowing now for strangers. He thought of the bar wall where his soldier's photo still hung, even as men laughed at him beneath it. Tears mixed with rain. Indistinguishable. For a moment, memory carried him back to war. He had lain in trenches on nights like this. Rain seeping through mud. To the breath of comrades beside him, proof he was not alone. Now, if he collapsed, only the river would remain, flowing over his absence. With shaking fingers, he pulled out his notebook, opened a page. Water smeared the pencil marks as he scrawled. Rainy night. Pain. If I stop writing, perhaps I stop existing. If someone finds this, know I lived. And my name was Henry Wallace. Ink blurred, words melting into the page. He closed the book and clutched it. The pain surged again. Harsher. Sirens screaming inside his chest. He bent, nearly toppling. Clung to the post. Headlights pierced the storm. A truck slowed, then stopped. Our door slammed. A young voice called. Startled, "Sir, are you all right?" Henry lifted his head. Rain blinding him. A boy, 16, perhaps 17, ran toward him. Cheap raincoat plastered to his thin frame. The boy crouched, slipped an arm around him, eyes widening at the pallor of his skin. "God, you need a doctor." Henry could not answer, only drew a breath. In the boy's gaze he saw something he had missed for months. Recognition, not suspicion, not dismissal, but the acknowledgement of life. The boy pulled out a phone, fingers trembling, voice urgent yet steady. "There's an old man heart trouble by the river. Hurry." Henry closed his eyes, letting go. For the first time in months, he felt certain. His death, if it came, would not pass unseen. The rain still poured. The cold still gnawed. But within his chest, amid the pain, there beat another rhythm, the fragile yet undeniable pulse of being witnessed. The rain had not yet lifted. Heavy drops fell from the treetops, striking the torn tarp with icy weight, piercing through fabric to land on Henry Wallace's shoulders. He sat huddled inside the collapsed shelter, clutching the leather notebook. After the stormy night, his strength had drained further. His chest still ached, breath shallow, each inhalation short, clipped. He had managed a few trembling lines in his notebook when the growl of an engine rolled down the dirt road. The sound cut through the emptiness. Henry lifted his head, eyes narrowing against the sudden glare of headlights sweeping across the riverbank. The beam caught on the ragged tent, turning it into a shadow box of defeat. His heart quickened, thudding with dread. The truck stopped. The door swung open. A large figure stepped down, boots squelching in mud. Even before the face emerged, Henry recognized the swagger, the smirk, half hidden in shadow. Frank Doyle. Doyle did not waste breath on greeting. He advanced straight toward the ruined tent. Flashlight in hand. The beam slashed across Henry's face, forcing him to raise an arm. Doyle chuckled low. "So this is it. This is what you call a home now?" Henry said nothing. He forced himself upright, swaying with the effort. Doyle crouched, seized the edge of the tarp, and yanked. The fragile frame snapped, stakes ripping free. The tarp collapsed, spilling cold rainwater. Henry toppled backward, knees sinking in mud. Doyle stepped inside, eyes glinting with cruel delight. He sized Henry's suitcase, snapped it open, and pulled each item free: shirts worn thin, the faded photograph, the pill bottle. One by one he hurled them into the river. Each splash sent widening circles until the water swallowed them whole. "You've got nothing left," Doyle said flatly. "No one remembers you." "Oh." Henry crawled toward the suitcase, hands clawing at the mud. His voice rasped through shallow breath. "Frank, that was my life." Doyle bent, sneer curling. "Life? You think anyone cares? The papers say you're gone. My signature. Their signatures, every page stamped and legal. You're just a ghost clinging to ground that no longer bears your name." "Oh." Henry sagged forward, forehead pressed into wet soil. Pain ripped through his chest, heart pounding erratically, ears ringing. Doyle straightened, folding his arms, watching with idle amusement. "Maybe it should end here. No one will find you. No one will remember." When Henry closed his eyes, memories flooded. His mother's eyes the day he marched to war, his father's steady hand on his shoulder, the timber beams he himself had raised to build the porch. All of it blurred like a faded reel. If he collapsed now, those fragments would vanish with him. Sunlight slanted golden on the wall. Henry rose, fetched the old wooden plaque that had once hung by the porch. He laid it on the table, took a pocket knife, and carved slowly, "Wallace home." His hand trembled, the letters crooked, but each stroke deliberate. Each cut a heartbeat pressed into timber. One comrade grinned. "Ugly letters or not, it's yours." "Ins," Henry exhaled, nodding. Perfection was unnecessary. What mattered was truth. At dusk, they hung the plaque. The wind rocked it gently, making it creak. But the words shone pale beneath the crescent moon. Henry touched it with his palm. The grain was rough, grounding. His name had found a place to rest. That night, Henry did not curl beneath canvas or shiver beside the river. He lay in his old bed, mattress sunken, blanket thin. Every squeak of the frame felt familiar. He closed his eyes, listened to wind through the window, and knew he had returned. The following day, a few neighbors came. They did not arrive in crowds. One carried a basket of apples, another a box of pastries. They spoke briefly. "Welcome back. I'm sorry for before." Henry nodded. He held no bitterness. Change, he knew, rarely came with fanfare, but with quiet, halting steps. On the porch, he opened his leather notebook and wrote, "Day of return. Old house. Old friends. A small justice. But enough. No tent by the river. No ghost to be ignored. When passers-by look now, they know. My name is Henry Wallace." He closed the book. Overhead sparrows darted, their song piercing the wide sky. Henry lifted his head, a faint smile softening his face. One evening he sat with comrades again, staring over fields where wind rippled the grass like green waves. They spoke little. The silence itself held weight, echoing nights in bunkers long ago, when only the sound of another man's breathing was proof one was not alone. Henry's fingers brushed the wooden plaque. The carved letters steadied under his touch. He knew tomorrow his heart might fail again, that a morning could come when he did not wake. Yet if that moment arrived, someone walking past would see those words and know Henry Wallace had lived here. He gazed into mist rising from the valley and asked himself, what worth is a name if no one remembers? Or is it enough that one voice calls it true? The wind carried his question away. No answer returned, but Henry no longer needed one. The truth rested inside. A single person naming you, with kindness, was enough to anchor existence. Winter crept down, dusting frost across the roof. Henry sat in the kitchen, fire crackling gently in the stove. On the table lay his silver badge, and the notebook now filled. He did not add new lines. He turned pages slowly, then closed it. Outside children ran, laughter ringing against the cold air. One paused, tilted its head toward the porch sign, lips shaping the uneven letters. Wallace home. Another child came close, squinting. Then both burst into giggles before racing onward. Henry listened from his chair. Their bright voices lingered in the chill. His smile came softly, eyes falling closed. Not all would remember. Not every name endured. But so long as one young gaze lifted, reading those carved words, recognition lived. And that was enough.